I wasn't too deep on our content policies for like the first 10 years of the company. It was just kind of well known across the company that we were trying to give people the ability to share as much as possible. And issues would come up, practical issues, right? So if someone's getting bullied, for example, we deal with that, right? We put in place systems to fight bullying.
Right.
If someone is saying, hey, someone's pirating copyrighted content on the service, it's like, okay, we'll build controls to make it so we'll find IP protected content. But it was really in the last 10 years that people started pushing for like ideological based censorship. And I think it was two main events that really triggered this. In 2016, there was the election of President Trump, also coincided with basically Brexit in the EU and sort of the fragmentation of the EU. And then, in 2020, there was COVID. And I think that those were basically these two events where for the first time, we just faced this massive, massive institutional pressure to basically start censoring content on ideological grounds. At the time I was really sort of ill prepared to kind of parse what was going on, right? It's I think part of my reflection looking back on this is I kind of think in 2016 in the aftermath, I gave too much deference to a lot of folks in the media who were basically saying, okay, there's no way that this guy could have gotten elected except for misinformation. People can't actually believe this stuff, right? It has to be that there's this kind of like massive misinformation out there. Some of it started with the Russia collusion stuff, so I took this and just kind of assumed that everyone was acting in good faith. And I said, okay, well, there are concerns about misinformation. We should, just like when people raised other concerns in the past and we try to deal with them. Okay, yeah, people if you ask people, no one says that they want misinformation. So maybe there's something that we should do to basically try to address this. But I was really worried from the beginning about basically becoming this sort of decider of what is true in the world, right? That's like kind of a crazy position to be in for billions of people using your service. And so we tried to put in place a system that would deal with it. And early on tried to basically make it so that it was really limited. We're like, all right, we're just going to have the system where there's these third-party fact checkers and they can check the worst of the worst stuff, right? So things that are very clear hoaxes, that there's like, it's not like we're not parsing speech about whether something is slightly true or slightly false, like Earth is flat, things like that, right? So that was sort of the original intent. We put in place the system and it just sort of veered from there. I think to some degree, it's because some of the people whose job is to do fact checking, a lot of their industry is focused on political fact checking. So they just kind of veered in that direction. And we kept on trying to basically get it to be what we had originally intended, which is just, it's not, the point isn't to like judge people's opinions. It's to provide this layer to kind of help fact check some of the stuff that seems the most extreme. But it just, it was just never accepted by people broadly. I think people just felt like the fact checkers were too biased. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily even so much in what they ruled, although sometimes I think people would disagree with that. A lot of the time, it was just what types of things they chose to even go and fact check in the first place. So I kind of think like after having gone through that whole exercise, it I don't know, it's something out of like 1984, one of these books where it's just like it really is a slippery slope, and it just got to a point where it's just okay, this is destroying so much trust, especially in the United States, to have this program. And I guess it was probably about a few years that I really started coming to the conclusion that we were going to need to change something about that. COVID was the other big one, where that was also very tricky because, at the beginning it was, it's like a legitimate public health crisis, in the beginning. And it's, even people who are like the most ardent First Amendment, defenders, the Supreme Court has this clear precedent that's like, all right, you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. There are times when if there's an emergency, your ability to speak can temporarily be curtailed in order to get an emergency under control. So I was sympathetic to that at the beginning of COVID. It seemed like, okay, you have this virus. It seems like it's killing a lot of people. I don't know, like we didn't know at the time how dangerous it was going to be. So at the beginning, it kind of seemed like, okay, we should give a little bit of deference to the government and the health authorities on how we should play this. But when it went from, 2 weeks to flatten the curve to, and like in the beginning, it was like, okay, there aren't enough masks. Masks aren't that important. To then it's like, oh no, you have to wear a mask. And, everything was shifting around. It just became very difficult to kind of follow. And this really hit the most extreme, I'd say, during the Biden administration when they were trying to roll out the vaccine program. And I'm generally pretty pro rolling out vaccines. I think on balance, the vaccines are more positive than negative. But I think that while they're trying to push that program, they also tried to censor anyone who was basically arguing against it. And they pushed us super hard to take down things that were honestly were true, right? I mean, they basically pushed us and said, anything that says that vaccines might have side effects, you basically need to take down. And I was just like, well, we're not going to do that. Like, we're clearly not going to do that. I mean, that is kind of inarguable. People in the Biden administration. I think it was, I wasn't involved in those conversations directly, but I think it was. Yeah. So, I mean, like you're saying, I mean, it's so complicated, this system, that I could spend every minute of all of my time doing this and not actually focused on building any of the things that we're trying to do. AI, glasses, like the future of social media, all that stuff. So, I get involved in this stuff, but in general, we have a policy team. There are people who I trust. They're the people who are kind of working on this on a day-to-day basis. And the interactions that I was just referring to, I mean, a lot of this is documented. I mean, because Jim Jordan and the House had this whole investigation and committee into the kind of government censorship around stuff like this. And we produced all these documents, and it's all in the public domain. I mean, basically, these people from the Biden administration would call up our team and scream at them and curse. And it's like, these documents it's all kind of out there.
Oh, did you record any of those phone calls?
I don't think we were, but I think
I want to listen.
I mean, there are emails, the emails are published. It's all kind of out there. And they're like, and basically it just got to this point where we were like, no, we're not gonna take down things that are true. That's ridiculous. They wanted us to take down this meme of Leonardo DiCaprio looking at a TV talking about how 10 years from now or something, you're going to see an ad that says, okay, if you took a COVID vaccine, you're eligible for, for this kind of payment, this sort of class action lawsuit type meme. And they're like, no, you have to take that down. And we just said, no, we're not going to take down humor and satire. We're not going to take down things that are true. And then at some point, I guess, I don't know, it flipped a bit. I mean, Biden, when he gave some statement at some point, I don't know if it was a press conference or to some journalists, where he basically was like, these guys are killing people. And I don't know, then all these different agencies and branches of government basically just started investigating, coming after our company. It was brutal. It was brutal.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's basically the journey that I've been on. Right, started off very pro free speech, free expression, and then over the last 10 years, there have been these two big episodes. It was the Trump election and the aftermath, where I feel like in retrospect, I deferred too much to the kind of critique of the media on what we should do. Mm-hmm. And since then, I think generally trust in media has fallen off a cliff. Right, so I don't think I'm alone in that journey. I think that's basically the experience that a lot of people have had is, okay, it's the stuff that's being written about is not kind of all accurate. And even if the facts are right, it's kind of written from a slant a lot of the time.
Of course.
And then there was the government version of it, which was during COVID, which is, okay, it's like our government is telling us that we need to censor true things. It's like, this is a disaster. And it's not just the U.S., right? I think a lot of people in the U.S., focus on this as an American phenomenon, but I kind of think that the reaction to COVID probably caused a breakdown in trust in a lot of governments around the world. Because, I mean, 2024 was a big election year around the world. And, there are all these countries, India, just like a ton of countries that had elections. And the incumbents basically lost every single one. So there is some sort of a global phenomenon where the whether it was because of inflation, because of the economic policies to deal with COVID, or just how the governments dealt with COVID, seems to have had this effect that's global, not just the U.S., but like a very broad decrease in trust, at least in that set of incumbents, and maybe in sort of these democratic institutions overall. So I think that what you're saying of, how do people get their information now? It's by sharing it online on social media. I think that that's just increasingly true. And my view at this point is like, all right, like we started off focused on free expression. We kind of had this pressure tested over the last period. I feel like I just have a much greater command now of what I think the policies should be. And like, this is how it's going to be going forward. And so I mean, at this point, I think a lot of people look at this as like a purely political thing. It's because they kind of look at the timing and they're like, hey, well, you're doing this right after the election. It's like, okay, I try not to like change our content rules like right in the middle of an election either, right? It's like there's not like a great time to do this. It's
right.
It's like there's no good time to do it. There's, right. And whatever time is going on, there's going to be, so the good thing about doing it after the election is you get to take this kind of cultural pulse as like, okay, where are people right now, and how are people thinking about it? We try to have policies that reflect, mainstream discourse, but. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. This is something I've been thinking about for a while. I think that this is going to be pretty durable because at this point, we've just been pressure tested on this stuff for like the last 8 to 10 years with like these huge institutions just pressuring us. And I feel like this is kind of the right place to be going forward. Yeah. I mean, the tough thing with politics is that there's like, well, when you say someone's coming after you, are you referring to kind of the government and investigations and all that? I mean, so the issue is that there's what specific thing an agency might be looking into you for, and then there's like the underlying political motivation, which is like, why do the people who are running this thing hate you? And I think that those can often be two very different things. So, I mean, we had organizations that were looking into us that were like not really involved with social media. Like I think like the CFPB, like this financial, I don't even know what it stands for. It's the financial organization that Elizabeth Warren had set up.
Oh, great.
And it's basically, it's like, we're not a bank.
The debanking section.
Yeah, no, so like we're not a bank, right? It's like what does Meta have to do with this? But they kind of found some theory that they wanted to investigate, and it's like, okay, clearly they were trying really hard, right, wow. to find some theory, but it like, I don't know, it kind of like throughout the party and the government, there was just sort of, I don't know how this stuff works. I mean, I've never been in government. I don't know if it's like a directive or it's just like a quiet consensus that like, we don't like these guys, they're not doing what we want, we're going to punish them. But it's tough to be at the other end of that.
What was it like?
Well, it's not good. I think. Well, the thing that I think is actually the toughest, though, is it's global, right? So, and really, when you think about it, the U.S. government should be defending its companies, right? Not be the tip of the spear attacking its companies. So when we talk about a lot. Okay, what is the experience of? Okay, if the U.S. government comes after you, I think the real issue is that when the U.S. government does that to its tech industry, it's basically just open season around the rest of the world. Right? I mean, the EU, I pulled these numbers. The EU has fined the tech companies more than $30 billion over the last, I think it was like 10 or 20 years.
Holy shit.
So when you think about it, like, okay, it's like, $100 million here, a couple $1 billion there. But what it, I think really adds up to is this is sort of like a kind of EU-wide policy for how they want to deal with American tech. It's almost like a tariff. And I think the U.S. government basically gets to decide how are they going to deal with that, right? Because if the U.S. government, if some other country was screwing with another industry that we cared about, the U.S. government would probably find some way to put pressure on them. But I think what happened here is actually the complete opposite. The U.S. government led the kind of attack against the companies, which then just made it so like the EU is basically, and all these other places, just free to just go to town on all the American companies and do whatever you want. But I mean, look, obviously, like I don't want to come across as if like we don't have things that we need to do better. Obviously, we do. And when we mess something up, we deserve to be held accountable for that and just like everyone else. I do think that the American technology industry is a bright spot in the American economy. I think it's a strategic advantage for the United States that we have a lot of the strongest companies in the world. And I think it should be part of the U.S.'s strategy going forward to defend that. And it's one of the things that I'm optimistic about with President Trump is I think he just wants America to win. And I think some of this stuff, like the other governments who are kind of pushing on this stuff, it's like at least the U.S. has the rule of law, right? So the government can come after you for something, but you still get your day in court, and the courts are pretty fair. And so we've basically done a pretty good job of defending ourselves. And when we've chosen to do that, basically we have a pretty good rate of winning. It's just not like that in every other country around the world. Like if other governments decide that they're going to go after you, you don't always get kind of a clear shake at kind of defending yourself on the rules. So I think to some degree, if the U.S. tech industry is going to continue being really strong, I do think that the U.S. government has a role in basically defending it abroad. And that's one of the things that I'm optimistic about will happen in this administration. I think that there are a couple of different things here. One is, this is something where I think X and Twitter just did it better than us on fact-checking. We took the critique around around misinformation. We put in place this fact-checking program, which basically empowered these third-party fact-checkers. They could mark stuff false, and then we would downrank it in the algorithm. I think what Twitter and X have done with community notes, I think is just a better program. Rather than having a small number of fact-checkers, you get the whole community to weigh in. When people who usually disagree on something tend to agree on how they're voting on a note, that's a good sign to the community that there's actually like a broad consensus on this, and then you show it. And you're showing more information, not less, right? So you're not using the fact check as a signal to show less. You're using the community note to provide real context and show additional information. So I think that that's better. For when you're talking about like nation states or people interfering, a lot of that stuff is best rooted out at the level of kind of accounts doing phony things. So you get like, whether it's like China or Russia or Iran or like one of these countries, they'll set up these networks of fake accounts and bots, and they coordinate and they post on each other's stuff to make it seem like it's authentic and kind of convince people it's like, wow, a bunch of people must think this or something. And the way that you identify that is you build AI systems that can basically detect that those accounts are not behaving the way that a human would. And when we find that there's like some bot that's operating an account, there are some things that a person just would never do, right? So sophisticated, and it's an adversarial space. So so we find some technique, and then they basically kind of update their techniques. But we have a team of it's effectively like intelligence, counterintelligence folks, counterterrorism folks, AI folks who are building systems to identify what are these accounts that are just not behaving the way that people would, and how are they interacting, and then sometimes you trace it down, and sometimes you get some tips from different intelligence agencies, and then you can kind of piece together over time. It's like, oh, this network of people is actually some kind of fake cluster of accounts, and that's against our policies, and then we just take them all off. But yes, I think for the specific problem around these like large coordinated groups doing kind of like election interference or something, it's a large enough group. We have like a bunch of people analyzing it. It's like they study it for a while. I think we're probably pretty accurate on that. But I actually think one of the bigger issues that we have in our moderation system is this precision issue that you're talking about. And that is actually, of all the things that we announced this week, in terms of how we're going to update the content policies, changing the content filters to have to require higher confidence and precision is actually going to be the thing that reduces the vast majority of the censorship mistakes that we make. Right? Removing the fact checkers and replacing them with community notes, I think it's a good step forward. Like a very small % of content is fact checked in the first place. So is that going to make the hugest difference? I'm not sure. I think it'll be a positive step though. And we like opened up some content policies. So some stuff that was restricted before we opened up. Okay, that's good. It'll mean that some set of things that might have been censored before are not. But by far the biggest set of issues we have, and you and I have talked about a bunch of issues like this over the years, is like, it's just, okay, you have some classifier it's trying to find, say, like drug content, right? People decide, okay, it's like the opioid epidemic is a big deal. We need to do a better job of cracking down on drugs and drug sales, right? I don't want people dealing drugs on our networks. So we build a bunch of systems that basically go out and try to automate finding people who are dealing drugs. And then you basically have this question, which is how precise do you want to set the classifier? So do you want to make it so that the system needs to be 99% sure that someone is dealing drugs before taking them down? Do you want it to be 90% confident, 80% confident? And then those correspond to amounts of, I guess the statistics term would be recall. What % of the bad stuff are you finding? So if you require 99% confidence, then maybe you only actually end up taking down 20% of the bad content. Whereas if you reduce it and you say, okay, we're only going to require 90% confidence, now maybe you can take down 60% of the bad content. But let's say you say, no, we really need to find everyone who's doing this bad thing. And it doesn't need to be as severe as dealing drugs. It could just be, it could be any kind of content of any kind of category of harmful content. You start getting to some of these classifiers might have 80, 85% precision in order to get 90% of the bad stuff down. But the problem is if you're at 90% precision, that means 1 out of 10 things that the classifier takes down is not actually problematic. And if you kind of multiply that across the billions of people who use our services every day, that is millions and millions of posts that are basically being taken down that are innocent, and upon review, we're going to look at and be like, this is ridiculous that this thing got taken down, which, I think you've had that experience, and we've talked about this for a bunch of stuff over time. And but it really just comes down to this question of where do you want to set the classifiers? So one of the things that we're going to do is basically set them to require more confidence, which is this trade-off. It's going to mean that we will maybe take down a smaller amount of the harmful content, but it will also mean that we'll dramatically reduce the amount of people whose accounts were taken off for a mistake, which is just a terrible experience, right? It's like, okay, you're going about your day, and then one day you wake up and you're like, oh, my WhatsApp account just got deactivated because it's connected to a Facebook account, and the Facebook account is or like I'm using it on the same phone as a Facebook account where like we made some enforcement mistake and thought you were doing something bad that you weren't because our classifiers were set to too low of precision.
Has that happened?